Hello and welcome to Chess with Simon. I'm Simon. Today we're going to look at an absolutely wonderful game. Viktor Korchnoi versus Garry Kasparov, King's Indian Defence, as featured in this book, Kasparov on the King's Indian. I have various wonderful books lying around my house, which I'll be rustling through in the next few weeks. This is a great game in its own right, but also it teaches us a lot about the classical King's Indian and some of the tactical and strategic themes within it. So let's just dive in. We're looking at it from the black point of view, from the Kasparov point of view. Korchnoi starts with knight f3, which is a flexible way to start the game. Knight f6 from Kasparov. c4 from Korchnoi. So this is interesting. So this is the English opening. But he's got into an English without allowing e5. So he's not allowed these kind of reverse Sicilian positions, which actually Kasparov might be quite partial to. He played the Sicilian from both sides, so Kasparov might have gone for that in a normal English. g6 from Kasparov, and now we've got knight c3. So again, this is interesting because this stops the Grunfeld defence. Well, it stops the main line of the Grunfeld, so black can play d5 here, but he doesn't have this big white centre to aim at, which is what you would normally get in the Grunfeld. So you get a slightly different kind of game. So the committed Grunfeld player has to play d5 here, because as we'll see, after bishop g7, pawn e4, now there is no d5 because that blunders a pawn. But Kasparov just fianchettos and plays d6. So Kasparov heading for a King's Indian type position. d4 from Korchnoi, and now we've re-entered the main line of the King's Indian. Kasparov castles, which is very natural. I mean, one of the great advantages of the King's Indian is quick development, quickly getting the king castled, and then while white's grabbing space, white is occupying the centre and grabbing space, black can often develop activity and you get a very interesting unbalanced struggle. Bishop e2 from white, classical King's Indian. Black plays e5, which is the most popular move here. White castles. Now, the modern engines prefer black to take here. And this is a valid move to take on d4, but you get a very different kind of game. Kasparov plays knight c6, which is the really interesting move that creates a very unbalanced position, because you're tempting white to play d5, and then after black's knight e7, you get a very unbalanced position where white's attacking on the queen side and black's attacking on the king side. Now, a number of players say, well, it's better to attack on the king side because that's where the king is. It's not quite that simple, because white is often one or two tempos ahead. I mean, firstly, white gets to move first. Secondly, white's got more space. But also, moves like knight c6, knight e7, they're actually wasting a tempo. So white's slightly ahead, so he's sometimes breaking through on the queen side before black breaks through on the king side. But then maybe white takes a rook on the queen side while black takes white's king or checkmates white. So it's a very unbalanced, exciting set of ideas. White plays knight e1 here. Now again, there are other options. Karpov used to play knight d2 at this point against Kasparov with pretty good results, actually. I think Kasparov was less keen on playing the King's Indian against Karpov. You can also play pawn b4, which is the bayonet attack. Now, pawn b4 allows knight h5, but knight e1 kind of doesn't, because if you play knight h5 now, white takes twice on h5. Knight d7 for Kasparov, and then Korchnoi plays this really provocative move, bishop e3. So this is very principled, makes the game very interesting. The point here is that this bishop attacks the queen side, and it's also just a developing move. The problem is that later on, black will play pawn f5, pawn f4, attack that bishop, and actually gain a tempo for his attack. So it's basically a very confrontational move. Some alternatives. Gelfand played knight d3 in 1990 against Kasparov, which is a less committal move. And actually that game ended in a draw. It ended in a more kind of manoeuvring type game. I like to do this. I like to play f3 here, and then after the natural f5 you can play g4. This looks wacky, but it's actually pretty solid because you know, it's so funny because there's a basic rule in chess, which is you don't move the pawns in front of your castled king, and this is absolutely doing that. But it works, and that's why chess is such an interesting game, because sometimes you can break the rules. But it creates space for the king. It puts a halt to the black attack. It kind of takes the steam out of it, because if black takes and then you swap the rooks, it kind of takes the heat out of things. So this is a solid way to meet it if you're looking for ideas as white. But Korchnoi's got his own ideas. Bishop e3, f5 from black, just this natural move getting the attack going. White plays f3 to defend the e-pawn. Now that isn't actually required on this move, but it's going to have to be played sometime, and it's a useful move. And here, black's got this f4 move, hitting the bishop, and the bishop moving back to f2. So we can see that already white's pieces are actually taking away squares from his king. They're crowding the king in. And later on, as the black pawns advance, the king is really struggling for oxygen. We'll see this becomes a factor, actually. But it's not. This is not bad for white. This is just. It's like a bullfight. It's just like almost goading black. g5 from black, and then Korchnoi plays a4 in an attempt to start to break up the queen side, open lines, maybe even bother this bishop on c8, which is often such an important factor in the King's Indian. Black starts the business of transferring pieces to the king's side to carry out this attack. White centralises the knight, knight d3. Again, the knight comes across to f6, so this is a great square. Hitting lots of central squares, also just opening up the diagonal for the bishop. And white plays this thematic move c5. So white is often looking to play c5 in the classical King's Indian. This could move to c6. This could take on d6, starting to attack this this weak pawn. It becomes a weak pawn on d6, and perhaps in some endgames this can become a real problem. But black doesn't worry about this. h5, black just gets on with it. So both players are pursuing their ideas independently. Now h3 from white. So what white's doing here is trying to stop this g4 move, because now this square is covered 1, 2, 3, 4 times, and it's only attacked 1, 2, 3. So this would now lose a pawn. So white's idea here is to stop this advance g4, which looks frightening, and will be even more frightening after rook f7 and rook swinging across as well. And indeed, black starts swinging the rook. c6 from Korchnoi. So Korchnoi's looking here to take on b7 and distract this bishop, which is hitting this important g4 square, and in some lands can also sacrifice itself on h3. After a move like g4, g3, you often get sacrifices on h3, and then maybe the queen coming in to take a second time on h3, and then arriving on h2, backed up by a pawn on g3. So these kind of themes are quite common, and Korchnoi is trying to nip this in the bud. Kasparov plays a5 here. Now he gives this a double exclamation mark. The modern engines don't like it so much, which just shows what a difficult game chess is, because Kasparov is an absolutely amazing chess player. Some might say the best chess player in history. I mean, discuss, Carlsen, Karpov, Fischer. There are various people who you could say were the best in history, and Kasparov, who was world champion for a long time, could definitely lay claim to that. So he gives us a double exclamation mark. Actually, the engines don't like it so much. They prefer bishop h6, just getting on with the kingside attack. And actually, Kasparov will play this later. So white forks the bishop and rook. This is forcing not forcing, effectively forcing the bishop to take here. You don't want to sack a rook at this point. So the bishop takes, and this does deflect the bishop from the work it was doing on the king's side. b4 from Korchnoi, so continuing to open up lines and attack on the queen side. Black puts the bishop back, and white wins a pawn. Black says, fine, have the pawn, I'm not bothered, it's only a pawn. Bishop h6. So this bishop's pretty useful, because it's possible that this diagonal will open up, actually, and in some variations the bishop can, for instance, check here, or can cause problems on this diagonal, maybe attacking a rook which might come to the c-file. Korchnoi plays knight b4, and it's heading for c6, and c6 looks like a great square because A, it's a weak square, and B, the knight will arrive at c6 with tempo, so it will hit the queen. So this looks like a good move, really. And at this point, black just says, right, I'm getting on with it. We're just going to break through. So he plays g4. Now, if we count, there's 4 pieces attacking that square, and there's that pawn, and there's only 3 defending it. But we could argue that material isn't really the point here. I mean, there are so many attacking chances. If we look, all of black's minor pieces can take part in an attack on the white king, plus the rook can swing, plus perhaps the queen can enter. So everything apart from the rook on a8 is trained on the white king, and this is why the King's Indian is such a wonderful and threatening opening. Knight c6, as we say, this looks like a good move, but actually it pushes the queen to a useful square. So this often happens in chess. You might make a move and it might come with tempo because a rook or a queen or even a king might have to move. But actually, sometimes they go to a square that's better, so it's worth asking if that's a good idea. I'm not sure if f8 is better than d8, but f8 certainly is a good square, and as we'll see, it comes in handy from f8. So white takes here. It's going to win this pawn. Black takes back. White takes back. White's now another pawn up. Come on, let's do a count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Plays 1, 2, 3, 4. 2 pawns up. Bishop g5 for black. Now your spidey sense may start to see that black's got some really good attacking chances here. It feels, if I were white here, I'd be really worried because you've got rook h7, you've got king h6, you've got pieces coming around to here. This square is weak. The king is boxed in by his rook and his bishop, and it's really tough. Korchnoi plays bishop f3, which, it's defending this pawn, but it's not really addressing the kind of crisis which seems to be appearing. Queen h6 from Kasparov, so he's really just 1 or 2 moves around from mate here. I mean, rook h7, queen h1 is checkmate. So now Korchnoi starts to create space for the king. Rook e1 to create an escape route out for the king. And Kasparov playing knight h4. Now the engines now say that basically black's winning, that basically white can't cope with this. White takes, black takes back, hitting the rook on e1, but also those dark squares around the king look really weak, and often in the King's Indian, black takes control of the dark squares. So weak dark squares are sometimes a problem for white in the King's Indian. This is a great example. Korchnoi gives one of the pawns back. Kasparov is critical of this move, but actually some of the engines like this move. But either way, white's sort of in desperation stakes here. Black just takes it off. So getting the queen off that important file, but still black has lots of chances. The rook moves away, so it doesn't get lost to the only square it can go to. And now you've got knight g4. So now all the pieces are just participating in this attack. And, if white takes there with the bishop, immediately the rook is skewered against the queen. So it's very hard to cope with this. Rook b1 Korchnoi plays. I suspect by this point he sort of knows what's going to happen. The writing's on the wall. Bishop g3 is fantastic, isn't it? It's just creating a mating net around the king, giving the queen the chance to go to h2, all sorts of threats. Korchnoi plays queen d3, and after queen h4, white resigned. Now, it's always fun, isn't it, just to think about how white might try and wriggle out of this. I mean, Korchnoi's a brilliant player, so he knows what he's doing. So this is one for black, but it's just interesting, what would you do as white? So the threat is queen h2, king f1, queen h1, which is checkmate. So you've got to move that rook. You've got to give the king that square to run to. So rook c2, for instance, and then the engines recommend this this wonderful move, bishop a6. So this bishop from here can do all sorts of things. It's hitting the queen, but also if the queen moved, it would take away the f1 square from the king, hence making queen h2 a checkmate. So white has to block with knight b5, but now black could play knight e3, again on one of these very weak dark squares. I mean, A, attacking the rook, but just much more importantly, after queen h2, it's mate again. So he's just cutting off this this square from the king. So this is just completely gone. So White was absolutely right to resign, and could resign with a clear conscience. So whenever White wins, the player of the black pieces has to say, well, you know, what went wrong? Because basically, chess, I think with best play, chess is a draw. I think we agree, chess is a draw with best play. So you ask the question, what went wrong? When Black wins, you've really got to ask the question, what went wrong? Because, you know, White should start with a small advantage. So if we just go through it, so you definitely can't criticise knight e1. This is just a matter of taste. I mean, there are other options like knight d2 and b4, but this is just a matter of taste. Bishop e3 is provocative, and it's not wrong. And the engines still have White better here, but if you like a quiet life, or, you know, if you don't like having your king attacked, I'd be careful about playing bishop e3, really. But after bishop e3, f5, f3, f4, bishop f2, g5. Now here, I think after this game, people have decided that a4 is not the right way to go. And the main line is knight d3, just developing and centralising that piece, which Korchnoi plays later anyway. Knight f6 for black, and then c5, just pushing on with that queenside attack. So these days, people are omitting this move 13a4. But the engines do not have White lost here. Where the engines think there's a mistake is later on. G6, knight d3, knight f6, c5, h5. h3 looks like the real mistake, the sort of strategic mistake. Because, yes, White wins a pawn after g4, but it creates so many holes for the black pieces to skip through. It's just not worth it. But actually, the engines still have it equal. Just in terms of pure tactics, the losing move for the engines is this one. So the losing move is when White takes on g4. So even after the g4 push, the engines believe that that White can survive by playing moves like a6. I've got to tell you, I wouldn't want to be in this position as White, not least because Black can take twice on h3, which looks incredibly hair-raising. But the engines don't think this is over until f takes g4, and then it really is over, because then Black's attack just runs. So I hope you've enjoyed looking at this. I've really enjoyed it. I'm going to look at more Kasparov games in the future. Two brilliant players who've given us a great experience, and also they've taught us a lot about the King's Indian defence. If you've enjoyed this, please do press the like button, and if you'd like to see more, if you hit subscribe and hit the bell, I will send you more in the future.